friends, welcome back to my channel. It's Tori. Today we're going to be talking about a struggle that I had reading this past month. I was expecting to love this book. If I'm being totally honest, when I went into this series, I 100% expected to absolutely love it. And the first book I enjoyed. I had a good time with it. I had some critiques, things that did not work for me, but overall, I could see the big picture of what was being presented, and it was making me really excited to continue. And when I picked up book 2, I was so ready. I was so ready to continue the journey that book 1 had set up for us. And I have had to sit on my feelings and thoughts about this book for multiple weeks since I finished it, because I wanted to be able to really articulate what it was about this book that did not work for me. And that, of course, is Howling Dark by Christopher Ruocchio. Now, this is book 2 in his Sun Eater series, which I think the final book is book 7, which is coming out later this year. And this series has been a very popular set of books around the community in the last couple of years, which is awesome. There's a lot of people that have been reading this and absolutely loving it. Now, I recognize that what I'm about to say about this book is probably not going to be a super popular opinion. And for that, I'm not going to apologize, but I've also promised you guys transparency and honesty with my reviews, and that includes books that I don't enjoy and explaining why. As always, I will start off with my non-spoiler review for those of you who have not read this book yet and just want to know my general thoughts on my experience, and then I will get into spoilers afterwards because, to be perfectly honest, it is hard for me to explain exactly why it is I didn't jive with this book very well without getting into some specifics, so I will do that momentarily. But for those of you who are looking for my non-spoiler thoughts on Howling Dark by Christopher Ruocchio, what I will say about this book is that the jump between book 1 and book 2 is quite jarring in terms of the storytelling structure and pacing and character continuity. And those things kind of started me off on the wrong foot in this book. I think that the world building and the large scale conflict of Sun Eater as a whole series is fascinating. I really loved what Ruocchio set up in Empire of Silence, and I enjoyed the bits and pieces of the world building aspect, and I'll get into specifics later here in Howling Dark. The character work for me was really lackluster in this book, if I'm being totally honest, and I think in some ways that this story is actually lessened by its first-person narrative just because of the way the writing style portrays everything around our main character, Hadrian. So those things were really tough for me in this book. I liked it less than book 1, which apparently is not the normal experience for a lot of people. And while there was a ramp of tension, especially I would say in the last third of the book, that revealed some pretty cool things in terms of the world building, by the time I got there, I had detached so much because of the writing style and the character work or lack of it, that those impacts didn't have the weight that I wanted them to. But that is officially the end of my non-spoiler thoughts on this book. I'm keeping them pretty short and sweet because my overall opinion was that I did not enjoy this book very much. And it was a real struggle for me to finish it, and that's just my completely transparent, honest thought. So, moving on into getting into some spoilers so I can articulate why, specifically, Howling Dark did not work for me. Okay, so where to start with this? I feel like the root of a lot of the problems I had with Howling Dark started right away in the first couple of chapters. The pacing of book 1 was a little bit erratic, and I mentioned that in my original review that was a struggle for me, and it felt like the different sections of the book had drastically different pacing, and it was quite jarring the way that the story was structured, and sometimes we were just kind of like getting through events to move to the next thing. So at the end of book 1, we had a fantastic setup for moving into book 2. The motley crew was together on the ships. We were, kind of getting a better feel for all of these different factions within the Empire, and Hadrian trying to navigate between all of them. We were heading out into the galaxy to see if we could find more information about the Quiet and the Cielsen and Vargosos and all of these things that we've been building up through a lot of book 1. And I was so ready. I opened this book, Howling Dark, so ready to jump right in and go, because I felt like a lot of the things I enjoyed the most about book 1 were right there on the surface of the story, and we were just ready. We were ready to jump in. And then we got to book 2, and I started reading the first few chapters, and I had been kind of given a heads up that there was a little bit of a jarring start to book 2, that it was going to be a bit of a jump. So I went in with that expectation, but I was not expecting what I found. The jump in time is something that isn't always a bad thing. I have read it in other stories where it worked. I think in this book it was a huge storytelling mistake. Because we are in a first-person point of view, the character of Hadrian is to some extent synonymous with the reader, because we are seeing everything through Hadrian's eyes, through his immediate voice, and it's a very intimate experience with the environment of the story. Because of that, when we jump forward in time and we've lost 47 years total, but 12 years of Hadrian's waking life when he wasn't in fugue, and we're supposed to just sort of pick up where we left off, but nothing is the same. Everything is drastically different. We had this, whether it was friendship or relationship building up with Valka at the end of book 1, and now suddenly Valka's been shoved onto a back burner, and Janan apparently is the new girlfriend, and we're just supposed to accept this relationship that she and Hadrian have built outside of our experience. And also, we're just sort of meandering through space. Nothing really exciting is happening. The frustration I felt with having been removed from those 12 years of Hadrian's life between book 1 and book 2, if nothing quote-unquote interesting had happened and we were just sort of flying around in space and some basic shifts had happened within relationships or what have you, I could see where that could have potentially worked. But the fact is, everything that happened between book 1 and book 2 is drastically more interesting than anything that happened in the first half of Howling Dark. And that frustrated me so much. I was like, okay, cool. So nothing happened other than the fact that Hadrian, there was a massive spaceship mutiny, and Hadrian went and freed a planet and was in a war and became a soldier. And, no big deal. That frustrated me so much because I felt like we skipped over pieces of the story that we really needed to be a part of that could have added a lot of depth and interest to the relationship dynamics that would have brought us to this point where we start in Howling Dark in a much more organic and immersive way. Whereas now we're just supposed to, oh yeah, I guess that wasn't important, no big deal. And now, of course, Janan is the lady of the hour, and Valka has just been thrown into the background. Switch has just kind of been thrown into the background. He's still there, but we'll get to Switch briefly. But that really frustrated me right in the beginning of the story, and it kind of shoved me off balance a little bit, and I never really found my footing again through the rest of the story. Now, I pushed on because everybody told me, don't worry, you'll get to a certain part in the story, things will pick up, it'll be so much better, you'll be hooked, it'll be fine. And I can see the points in the story where they were intending for that to happen, but it just didn't work. And I'll tell you why. Because for me, and again, I've mentioned this on my channel so many times, I am a character first reader every single time. And this series is plot driven, and I will explain myself briefly. But yes, there are strong characters within the series. We have an intimate first person view, so on the surface level it looks like a character driven story, but it's not, because a lot of the things that were happening, the plot came first and the characters were just sort of drug along after it. And Hadrian, as a protagonist, is so stuck in his own head that we don't get depth with anybody else in the story. And his fling with Janan in the beginning, I was so over it from the first day, because this was not the relationship that I had built up. I didn't know who this person was, and I came off of Empire of Silence kind of like ready to move into whatever was happening, but instead of showing us how we got from point A to point B, we were just kind of left to flounder in the dark while Hadrian contemplates the dark. Hadrian became obnoxiously reflective in this book, and I like internalized reflective characters, and I didn't think I had a limit on that until I read this book, because Hadrian spends so much time pondering and reflecting and contemplating that he doesn't really immerse us in reality as much as he immerses us in his own inner monologue constantly throughout the story. If Rocchio had spent half the time working on the relationships between Hadrian and the other characters and the environment around him as he spent on Hadrian just being the thinking man statue, I would have liked this book so much more. Relationships like Hadrian and Valka, or Hadrian and Switch, or Hadrian and the other gladiators from book 1 are given these tiny little cameos, and instead of actually showing us build up between these characters, Rocchio relies very heavily on prose repetition and descriptive repetition to constantly tell the reader what something is or how they're supposed to feel about it. And an example that I have of that is the relationship that Hadrian has with Switch. Hadrian and Switch in book 1 was my favorite part of the entire story. Switch was my favorite character. I loved the dynamic between the two of them. And then we get into book 2, and Switch was so far in the background. Like, he showed up on screen a couple of times and had like little bits of dialogue here and there, but really it wasn't enough to like add any depth to what we had started with in book 1, and Valka was much the same. But with Switch specifically, so many times when he would appear on page, in any context, he's described as, and Switch, my oldest friend and lictor, or my dearest friend and lictor. I started getting so tired of seeing that phrase. And I think as I went throughout the story, it started kind of representing for me a deeper problem with the story, which was that Rocchio was telling us, Switch is his oldest friend. By the way, Switch is his oldest friend. By the way, Switch is his oldest friend. You need to remember that because I'm not showing you that. I need you to remember it because I'm telling you. And because of that repetition, it started to get monotonous and tedious and frustrating to me as a reader, who I'm smart enough as a reader to remember things or to glean things from what I'm being shown in the storytelling, that Rocchio doesn't have to remind me every 5 minutes to kind of cover up the fact that nothing of depth is going on. There were descriptions of other characters as well later on in the book when Rain Smythe shows up. The way that she is introduced when she comes back into the story a few times is almost word for word the same description that talks about her class and her surgery, and the phrasing is so incredibly similar that it left me wondering, is there anything else about this character that you can tell me, or are we just repeating what you told me 10 pages ago? And that made the book feel so much longer. The repetition, not just of specific phrasing or descriptions, but also of concepts. The fact that Hadrian would sit down and he would ponder about these existential things was fine, but when it's just rehashing the same reflections over and over and over through the book, at the expense of very little plot movement and very little character development, it starts to feel exhausting for all the wrong reasons. Also, speaking of the repetition, there was a element of this story that was present very heavily in book 1, but in book 2 it just kept going to the point where I added a tab on my annotation post-it note only to mark moments where Hadrian's melodrama or him being an actor in a Eudoran play was mentioned. There is a tab in this book on my annotations just for that, because it's so repetitive. And again, this is where the writing style, I think, takes away from the character depth, because I'm being told constantly these things about the characters that I'm supposed to remember, but I'm being shown surprisingly little. Now, I do want to talk about the world building, because like I said before, that is one of the areas of this series that I feel really shines. The conflict with the Cielsen is my favorite part of Sun Eater. And it is one thing for an author to write aliens in their story or write non-human races. It is quite another skill set entirely for them to make those aliens or non-human characters feel inhuman and feel otherworldly. And that is something that I think Rocchio does exceptionally well. Every time there was a Cielsen character on page, I was invested, I was intrigued. It felt different. They felt alien. And I love that he put so much attention to the differences in culture and language and really dug into how hard that would make negotiations or peace between these different nations, and the history behind both the humans and the Cielsen that brought them to this point, and how it's making any kind of understanding between them almost impossible. That aspect of this book I thought was brilliant, and I really, really enjoyed it because it was such a character-focused element of the story. I also want to talk about Karn Sagara as a character in the story, other than a scene that happens with Naya, if you know, you know. I thought his character was really intriguing. So the scene with Naya, for me, it wasn't... I didn't necessarily think that Rocchio shouldn't have included something like that, or that it didn't say something really interesting about Hadrian's character, but it seemed very out of place for Karn Sagara from everything else that we'd been shown and told up until that point. So that was a scene that just felt incredibly uncomfortable and unnecessary for me. But overall, I felt like Karn Sagara was a really interesting part of this book, and especially the ending and the way that his consciousness is translated into the new hosts, and how that whole... There was a lot of things in that I found really intriguing. The Painted Man is an interesting one because I thought he was fascinating, and that was the first time in the book that I really kind of latched onto something and thought, ooh, okay, this is interesting. But I still don't really understand the point of him being there. And it is quite possible that he shows up again or something of that nature later on in the series. But if the whole point of the initial confrontation with the Painted Man and all of these AI people was to have Hadrian run into them so that he can have a callback later on in the story where he's like, oh, these AI soldiers, I know what these are, and because we had this situation with the Painted Man earlier on in the book. Okay, fine. Again, that feels really basic to me, and the Painted Man felt like way too cool of a concept to just drop in and then throw away right away. So I felt like that was kind of a missed opportunity. And again, he might show up later. I don't know, because I haven't read further than Howling Dark, but overall that one was kind of a letdown for me more than anything else. Now, when I talk about this book being plot driven, what I'm referring to specifically is that if there's a moment where the plot needs to go to a certain point, I can see where the characters are sacrificed in order to make that happen. As a character-focused reader, if you're going to put the plot over your characters, I am going to detach from what's going on more than I would otherwise. And there were so many moments in this book where characters would do things that seemed wildly out of character for them, and not in a way that it was like, oh man, somebody really went off the deep end and I can see why. Switch's betrayal was one of them, and I think if we had built up to it and actually had some deeper character development through the book up until that point, I would have bought it. I would have been like, yep, this makes sense. But it was so surface level for so much of the book, and Hadrian is so like obsessed with his own reflection that we don't see the buildup of a lot of these things. We don't see the tension rising, and it just sort of happens, and then I'm left with sort of a, well, okay, I guess that needed to happen so that this other thing could happen. Now, you could definitely make an argument that Hadrian, being so obsessed with his own reflections and monologues and spending time with his own existential thoughts, he would miss a lot of things. Sure, there's definitely an argument that can be made for that. But then I would say, okay, but it's also a story. And that's fine, but it's going to lessen my sense of immersion if Hadrian is the only person that matters, really, in this entire story, which is how it felt for most of Howling Dark. Later on, towards the end, there were decisions made by other characters that were even more that way, one of which was Valka being completely fine with the fact that Hadrian killed Nobuta. She kind of has a moment about it, and then everything's fine, and that we just drop it and move on, despite the fact that she has spent her whole character arc up until this point opposing violence and being so like, don't kill if you can help it. And I just feel like that would have been a sore spot between her and Hadrian more, and there was an opportunity there for some friction and struggle between her and Hadrian that could, in the future, build them closer together, if that's the intent, or not, whatever the author decides to do with it. But that was a moment that, again, it was like, well, it had to happen for the plot, and I also need these characters to not be, like, at odds with each other right now, so we're just going to move right along past it. And then finally, probably the biggest character assassination in this book for me was Basander Lin. Because at the end, I understand that seeing Hadrian, quote-unquote, come back from the dead would be shocking. And I can definitely see where it would cause a dynamic shift between Hadrian and the people around him. We haven't really seen Hadrian interacting with the masses at large, so they don't even really know who he is, as far as I'm concerned, because I haven't seen any of that. But Basander Lin's complete 180 in character at the end of this book, just so Hadrian can have this great grandstanding hero cliche moment, was kind of the final straw for me, to be honest. I could see where Basander Lin might soften towards Hadrian, or that he would... But in all honesty, based on what we have seen up until this point, what I would have expected is that Basander would have distrusted Hadrian. What kind of, witchcraft or plot with Karn Sagara or whatever did you... Like, he doesn't trust Hadrian at all, and he doesn't like Hadrian at all. So to go from that to borderline hero worship and submission at the end of this book, just so that Hadrian can stand up on his pedestal and be like giving his Braveheart speech to everyone assembled there, it felt so overdone and melodramatic. I'll use the word because it's very applicable to this book. Hadrian reminds us of that often enough anyway. So there were moments like that constantly throughout the book where I felt like the plot was pulling us one way and the characters could do nothing but follow, and thus we as the reader. When Hadrian and Valka finally have their get-together moment later on in the story, I was so frustrated because I felt like we spent way more time building Janan and Hadrian at the beginning of this book, and that Hadrian and Valka was just like, oh, and then they decided they're together or something. I don't know. I still don't really know what status their relationship has, and I'm sure they don't really either. But okay, I guess that's happening now. When it comes to the prose of Sun Eater, I think that Rocchio has some really beautiful passages. I think there are some moments in here, even within Hadrian's plethora of reflective moments that are really profound and beautiful. And I really loved those, and I tabbed quite a few of them here in the book. I think what takes away from that for me a little bit is that in the rest of the story, a lot of the prose feels incredibly overburdened. It feels like in a lot of areas, it's just too much. It's just too much. And the dialogue between the characters does not match Hadrian's internal, very sophisticated and very almost archaic, lush prose style thoughts. And then everybody speaks to each other in the most basic dialogue way possible. And that's kind of, again, a jarring, weird difference that kind of pulls you out of the overall beauty of the storytelling. Now, I have heard from a few people as I've been talking about this book that the jarring beginning of book one was intentional in order to make the reader feel jarred out of fugue, like to kind of mimic the feeling of what it would be like to go to sleep for multiple years and then wake up in a different time and you've traveled or whatever, which I understand why that's getting brought up. But I don't feel like it's necessary, because back in book one, we had a moment where Hadrian woke up out of fugue completely abandoned and in the middle of a gutter with nothing to his name. And that was super jarring for us as a reader in a way that worked well. I found that to be way more effective than the beginning of Howling Dark for showing me what fugue felt like. And again, that's a repetition thing. If it's been done already, and we've given the reader that experience, we don't need to do it over and over and over again like the reader didn't get it the first time. So that's my one response to that comment that I've been getting a lot. I understand the thought behind it, but I really do not think that it worked well for this book. So yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on this, and I'm really bummed that I did not like it more than I did, but I struggled to get through this book, you guys. I really, really struggled to get through this book. And I would say that started really from the first few chapters of the story, where the jarring jump back in from book one to book two just set us off on the wrong foot, and it just got more overburdened and more plot driven and more frustrating from there, to the point that it overshadowed a lot of the things that I did really enjoy about Howling Dark. So anyways, I am planning on giving Demon in White a chance. I will probably read up to probably 100 to 150 pages just to feel out whether or not I think it's gonna pull my interest. But I am taking a break because I really struggled with this book and I did not have a fantastic experience with it, which makes me sad. Honestly, you guys, there is nobody more bummed about this than I am, because I fully expected to love this book. I really did. And I went into it so ready and excited for the next chapter of Hadrian's story. And I feel exhausted. This book makes me feel exhausted, and I don't like that. That makes me very sad. But I've always promised you guys honest, transparent thoughts on the books that I read, and I didn't want this one, despite its popularity, to be any different. So if you've read this book, I would love to hear your thoughts on Howling Dark and the series of Sun Eater as a whole down in the comments below. It's really fun to see other people's perspectives on the same books. And if you love this series, that is so awesome, and I appreciate that, and I completely support you loving this series. So please don't take this review as me saying that I don't think people should enjoy this book or this series, because that's not what I'm saying at all. All I'm doing is sharing what my experience was with Howling Dark. So anyways, leave me some notes down in the comments. Let me know what you thought of Howling Dark, and if you've read beyond it, where you think it goes in terms of the tone and style from here, and anything else you want to let me know. I hope that whatever you are reading right now, that it is a 5-star read, and that you're having a great week. And I will see you all in the next video.